At 7:32 p.m. on June 15, 1944, a bazooka round moved across the fading light over Saipan. It came from an American position hidden in the brush. The rocket struck the left side of a Japanese Type 97 tank. The vehicle exploded, and the fire briefly lit the trees around the ravine. The tank had been moving toward the command post of the 6th Marine Regiment. If it reached that location, it could disrupt radio traffic, destroy equipment, and cut the link between several Marine units fighting near the beachhead. Most of the Marines in the area did not see the explosion. They only knew that a Japanese armored force was approaching the gap between the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions. Inside that gap were a few hundred Marines preparing for a difficult night. The bazooka was fired by 1st Lieutenant Frank Tarkovsky and Private Herbert Hodges. Both men belonged to a small reconnaissance unit operating ahead of the main force. Their assignment that day was simple: move inland, locate Japanese positions, and report coordinates. The order was clear. They were not to engage unless there was no other option. The shot that destroyed the tank did not follow that directive. It was not part of the plan, but the consequences of the explosion were immediate. Japanese infantry nearby saw the fireball and adjusted their movement. The main formation shifted away from the ravine. The command post remained intact. The Marine units holding the line kept their communication open. A single round had changed the situation without anyone fully understanding why. To see how 2 scouts ended up in that position, it is necessary to look at the role of reconnaissance on Saipan and why report only was treated as a critical instruction. Deep reconnaissance had one main purpose. It gave Marine commanders a clear picture of Japanese defenses before the main force reached them. The scouts moved ahead of regular units, often hundreds of yards inland, and sent back coordinates for artillery and naval gunfire. Gunfire risked exposing them. If a scout team was discovered, Japanese patrols could search the area and cut them off. Losing a team meant losing the information needed to guide the assault. Report only reduced that risk. The scouts were expected to observe, record, and move on. They were not assigned to clear bunkers or engage enemy patrols. Their value came from staying unseen long enough to complete the mapping of the interior. The work required steady movement, quiet communication, and quick decisions. Terrain changed fast. Patrol routes shifted. Support was often far behind. Only a few Marines were comfortable working under those conditions. Lieutenant Tachovsky looked for those men deliberately. He selected individuals who operated well without direct supervision. Many came from disciplinary units. The Marine Corps considered them difficult. Tarkovsky saw that they handled pressure differently and did not freeze in uncertain situations. These were the Marines he chose for a mission that depended on silence, speed, and accuracy. The Marine Corps never intended to build a unit like this. 7 months earlier, at Tarawa, nearly 1,000 Marines had been killed in 76 hours. Afterwards, Colonel James Risley sent a blunt request up the chain. If he wanted fewer bodies on the beach, he needed better intelligence before the assault waves went in. That meant men who could slip ahead of the main force, find Japanese fortifications, and report coordinates with enough accuracy for naval gunfire to do the killing. But the Marine Corps didn't have a pipeline for that kind of Marine. The standard rifle companies produced disciplined fighters who worked well in formation. Risley needed something else entirely: men who didn't freeze when alone, who didn't wait for instructions when plans fell apart, and who could keep moving even when no one was watching. The solution came from an unlikely place: the punishment details. First Lieutenant Frank Tachki had a simple recruiting rule. When 2 Marines got into a fistfight, the loser went to the infirmary, the winner went to the brig, and the winner was exactly who he wanted. A man who fought his way into trouble was usually the same man who could fight his way out of it. Over several weeks at Camp Tarawa, he pulled 40-plus men from brig lists, work details, and disciplinary rosters. Some had civilian records for assault or theft. One had boxed professionally. Another had once worked security for a Chicago gangster. None of them fit the Marine Corps' image of the ideal infantryman. But they were quick, aggressive, and unbothered by operating without a rule book. And that was exactly the point. At Tarawa, they trained on skills no conventional platoon spent time on: how to move through jungle without leaving a trail, how to approach a sentry from the rear, how to break contact without firing a shot, and how to read Japanese defensive layouts well enough to predict where a machine gun nest would be before seeing it. They weren't taught to win firefights. They were taught to avoid them. By June 1944, the 40 Thieves, as other Marines called them, were something new in the Pacific. They weren't line infantry, they weren't scouts, they weren't snipers. They were a reconnaissance force built around one idea: move farther, see more, and send back information that could save hundreds of lives. Which is why their Saipan orders were so strict. Report only, don't engage, don't reveal yourselves. That was the rule, until the moment everything in front of them made that rule impossible to follow. Saipan's southern beaches were chaos when Tachki's platoon hit the water. Mortars landed in the surf. Machine gun fire swept the sand. Units were already taking losses before they reached the seawall. But the 40 Thieves had a different route. Their mission was to move past the fighting, into terrain no other Marine had stepped into yet. By 9:30 a.m., they were 300 yards inland, farther forward than any unit on the division's maps. The jungle closed behind them. The noise of the beach faded, replaced by insects, humidity, and the sense that thousands of Japanese soldiers were somewhere ahead. Their orders held, report only. They spread out in a wide front, using hand signals Tachki had drilled into them for months. Moving in loose formation was risky for ordinary infantry, but it was the only way a small unit could scan more ground without giving itself away. At 10:15, Sergeant Bill Canup spotted it, a concrete pillbox dug into a ridge, almost invisible under foliage. Inside was a Type 92 heavy machine gun, positioned to fire straight into the valley where the 2nd Marine Division would advance that afternoon. Any battalion walking through that draw would be cut apart before they saw the weapon. This was exactly the sort of structure they were supposed to map and report. But reporting it wouldn't stop it. If they followed the rule, hundreds of Marines would die. Tachki studied the terrain, did the math, and made a decision. He had brought one bazooka team for contingencies like this. The range was about 80 yards. Strombo could make that shot. The blast would reveal their presence, but staying silent would cost far more lives elsewhere. At 10:32, Strombo fired. The rocket slammed into the firing slit and detonated inside the pillbox. The crew never had time to react. Before the smoke settled, the Thieves were already gone, another 300 yards deeper into the trees, erasing any trace they'd been there. Naval gunfire hit the ridge hours later. Marine assault units walked through the valley without taking a single round from that position. No one on the beach knew who had saved them. The deeper the platoon moved, the more they found. Machine gun nests, mortar pits, observation posts hidden under brush. The Japanese had turned the interior of Saipan into a network of killing zones. By noon, the 40 Thieves had mapped 17 positions, more than some regiments identified in an entire day. Each coordinate Tachki transmitted triggered shells from destroyers offshore. Japanese defenses were crumbling before the main force even arrived. Their mission was working. Their training was working, but none of it prepared them for what they found next. 37 tanks. An entire battalion, far more than Marine intelligence believed existed on the island. And they were warming their engines. The tank grove appeared without warning, a quiet pocket of flat ground hidden beneath a canopy of trees. What looked at first like scattered shapes under camouflage netting resolved into something far more serious. 37 Type 97 medium tanks. 3 times what Marine intelligence believed the Japanese had on Saipan. Tank battalions rarely stayed still during an invasion. If they weren't already on the move, they were preparing to be. And every Marine on that island knew what a Japanese armored counterattack could do to a beachhead struggling to unload men and supplies. If those tanks reached the coast before dark, the line could buckle. A breakthrough wasn't impossible. It had happened on other islands. Tachki radioed the coordinates immediately. The answer came back fast, and not the answer he hoped for. Every available support asset was already committed. Artillery was still being unloaded from ships. Naval gunfire was tied to units pinned down near the beach. Aircraft were tasked elsewhere. Earliest help, 4 hours. Too late. By then, nightfall would cover the tanks. They would move. They would attack. And the Marines on the beach wouldn't be ready. Tachki stepped back, counting rocket tubes. His platoon carried 6 bazookas. 6 rockets each. 36 total. 36 rockets. 37 tanks. It was a ridiculous comparison. A recon platoon doesn't attack an armored battalion. That principle wasn't taught. It was obvious. But the men behind him weren't ordinary Marines. They were fighters pulled from the brig, men who didn't think in terms of what was appropriate. They thought in terms of what was possible. And the simple fact was this: doing nothing would cost far more lives than trying. At 4:15 p.m., Tachki gave the order to prepare for assault. They moved carefully, placing each bazooka team 40 yards apart in a loose semicircle. Shooters checked their sights. Loaders laid out rockets. The plan was crude but workable. Hit as many tanks as possible in the first 30 seconds, create confusion, then vanish before the infantry realized what happened. They weren't going to destroy the whole battalion, but disabling even 10 or 15 tanks would change the shape of the night. Then everything shifted. At 4:25, the first engines coughed to life. One, then another. Seconds later, the grove filled with the deep, rhythmic growl of 37 diesel engines warming up together. Japanese crews emerged from dugouts, climbing onto their vehicles. Officers gathered men into formation. Infantry units moved into columns. This wasn't a routine repositioning. This was the opening move of a major attack. The moment the engines roared, the thieves lost their window. Any shot now would expose them instantly. The surprise was gone. Their attack plan evaporated in seconds. Tachki recalculated. There was still a way to influence the battle, by staying close, tracking the tanks, and feeding coordinates to Marine commanders who now knew an armored assault was coming. He gave a new order. Shadow the formation. Report everything. Don't be seen. No recon platoon had ever followed a tank battalion this closely before. But the 40 Thieves were already deeper into enemy territory than any American unit on Saipan, and the tanks had started to move. The tank battalion rolled out at 5:07 p.m., moving in 2 long columns through the interior jungle. Infantry units advanced alongside them, about 1,000 soldiers in total. It was the kind of force designed to break a line quickly, using armor to punch through and infantry to widen the breach. From a position 200 yards off the flank, the 40 Thieves tracked every shift in direction. Every 10 minutes, Tachki radioed updated coordinates. The transmissions moved up the chain fast. On the beach, Marine officers began reshaping defensive lines. Bazookas were redistributed. Sherman tanks rumbled forward. Artillery batteries adjusted their aim. Most Marines on Saipan didn't know where the Japanese tanks were, only that something big was coming. The 40 Thieves knew exactly where they were. Just after 6:15 p.m., a mile from the coast, the Japanese formation halted. Officers gathered around a map table, arguing and gesturing toward different routes. From Tachki's vantage point, the discussion looked tense. His men watched through binoculars, trying to guess what the delay meant. 11 minutes passed. Then the decision was made. Instead of continuing toward the main beachhead, where Marine lines were strongest, the tanks turned north. It didn't make sense at first. The map showed mostly jungle in that direction, rough ground with little tactical value. But as the battalion advanced, the path clarified. They weren't aiming for a fortified position. They weren't trying to hit the heaviest concentration of American troops. They were heading toward a seam. A thin gap between the 2nd and 4th Marine divisions, 2 units advancing on parallel axes with a vulnerable space between them. Under ideal conditions, the gap would be filled with overlapping fields of fire. On Saipan, in late afternoon light, that coverage wasn't perfect. A successful breakthrough here could split the American force in 2. By 7:05 p.m., as the sun dropped toward the horizon, Tachki understood what the Japanese intended. He radioed the warning immediately, but dusk was arriving. Radio traffic was shifting to night procedures, and artillery batteries were in the middle of resupply. Tanks were refueling. The timing couldn't have been worse. The gap was thinly defended. 2 Marine companies, about 340 men, facing a battalion of tanks with 1,000 infantry in support. At 7:23 p.m., the Japanese attack began. The 40 Thieves saw it unfold from a ridge overlooking the valley. The first 3 tanks were hit by Marine bazookas and erupted in flames, but dozens more pressed forward. Japanese infantry followed closely, shouting as they advanced. Marine forward positions bent under the pressure. The Japanese push was gaining momentum fast. If the tanks held their pace, they would reach the beach in 15 minutes. This was the scenario planners feared, a massed armored thrust hitting the weakest link between 2 divisions. If the line broke here, the beachhead wasn't just threatened, it could collapse entirely. And as the Thieves watched the attack unfold, Tachki saw something the Marines on the ground could not. One tank had peeled away from the main formation. It was moving fast, following a narrow ravine that led directly toward the regimental command post of the 6th Marines. If that tank reached its target, senior officers would be killed, communications severed, and the entire defensive response thrown into chaos. The Japanese had found their own seam, and Tachiki had minutes, maybe less, to close it. The lone Japanese tank moved with purpose, straight down a narrow ravine that curved toward the command post of the 6th Marine Regiment. It wasn't wandering, it wasn't probing. The crew had found a weakness in the terrain, a stretch of brush and steep ground that made it almost impossible for Marines to position anti-tank weapons. If the tank reached Colonel Risley's command post, it could wipe out radios, maps, and senior officers in seconds. Without that headquarters, the response to the main tank assault would collapse. Tachiki didn't need a briefing to understand the consequences. He simply turned and called for the man he trusted most with a bazooka, Private Herbert Hajek. Hajek had never missed a shot during training, 6 for 6 at Camp Tarawa. But those targets didn't move. They didn't shoot back, and they didn't have armor plates angled to deflect a rocket. The tank's frontal armor was thick enough to stop a poorly placed shot. A clean side hit was the only guarantee, and they were running out of time to get it. Tachiki and Hajek ran downhill through brush, staying low as the Japanese formation thundered in the distance. They reached a narrow spot along the ravine, 30 yards from where the tank would pass, close enough for accuracy, close enough to be seen if the commander happened to look up. Hajek dropped to the ground, steadied the tube, and waited. The tank engine grew louder, echoing between the walls of the ravine. Then the vehicle emerged, slow, deliberate, turret rotating as the commander scanned the fading light. The man stood in the open hatch, binoculars raised, trying to confirm his route to the command post. 15 yards, 10. Then the tank stopped. The commander leaned forward over his map. His crew idled the engine. For a few seconds, the vehicle was perfectly still, exactly the opening Hajek needed. He fired at 7:32 p.m. The rocket hit just below the turret ring on the tank's left side, one of the thinnest armor points on the Type 97. The shaped charge penetrated instantly. The explosion inside the crew compartment was violent and final. All 4 crew members were killed before the vehicle even rocked from the blast. 6 seconds later, stored ammunition ignited. The tank erupted in a fireball that lit the ravine and surrounding trees. From nearby slopes, Japanese infantry saw the explosion. What they didn't see were the 2 Marines who caused it. Instead, they assumed the blast came from a major defensive position, maybe a minefield, maybe a larger unit lying in wait. They shifted direction, turning away from the command post and toward the imagined threat. What Hajek thought would be a single life-saving kill accidentally misdirected a large portion of the Japanese infantry away from the most vulnerable point in the Marine lines. It bought the regiment time. It kept the command post functioning, and it helped stabilize the American response to the main tank assault. But the shot had consequences. The rocket's flash exposed Tachiki's location. Machine gun fire swept the trees around them. Mortars began to drop. Japanese patrols started moving toward the glow of the explosion. The 40 Thieves had just changed the course of the night, but now the jungle was coming for them. They had minutes to disappear or be overrun. The fireball from the destroyed tank lit the trees long enough for every Japanese soldier within 500 yards to know where the shot came from. Within seconds, rounds snapped through branches. Mortar tubes thumped in the distance. The 40 Thieves no longer had the luxury of choosing their next move. They had to vanish. With enemy fire tightening around them, Tachiki gave the signal to break into small teams. Moving as a single group in dense jungle under fire would have been suicide. 4 men here, 5 men there, spread out, move independently, and head for predetermined rally points behind Marine lines. It wasn't a clean withdrawal. The terrain worked against them. Thick brush, steep slopes, fallen trees. Japanese patrols were already sweeping the area. Every sound mattered. Every step mattered. At 8:05 p.m., one of the small teams, Strombo's group, froze as a Japanese patrol moved through the undergrowth. 7 soldiers, flashlights cutting thin beams across the leaves. The Marines lay flat, faces pressed to the dirt. One Japanese soldier stopped and stared directly at their hiding place. 10 seconds. 20. A full 43 seconds passed before he moved on. The patrol disappeared down the slope, unaware of how close they had come. By 9 p.m., roughly half the platoon had reached the main rally point, a clearing 600 yards behind Marine lines. Tachiki counted 23 men. 17 were missing. It was the kind of moment every small unit leader fears, trying to decide whether the men who haven't returned are lost, hiding, wounded, or dead. Standard procedure said wait up to 2 hours, but Japanese patrols were closing in. Staying risked making the rally point another ambush site. Tachiki made the call. Move the gathered men back to Marine lines now. Send search teams at first light. They moved out at 9:17 p.m. The closer they came to friendly lines, the more dangerous the approach became. Marine sentries, tired, jumpy, and on edge after hours of tank attacks, were known to fire first at any movement in the dark. Tachiki used the pre-arranged recognition signal. 3 short whistles, 2 long ones. A challenge came back from the darkness. Tachiki answered with the correct password. At 9:41 p.m., the first group crossed safely into American territory. 23 accounted for. 17 still missing. Behind them, the night battle continued. The Japanese tank attack had failed to punch through, but it had come close. Marines on the line reported armor probing forward until after 3 a.m. 11 tanks were knocked out by bazookas. 9 more by Sherman crews. Artillery disabled several others. By dawn, the Japanese had lost 27 of their 37 tanks. The line had held, but only just. When daylight finally came, the cost of the night became clearer. Search teams moved out at 6:30 a.m. to find the missing men. At 7:05, they found the first body. More followed. Others were found alive, dehydrated, exhausted, but still moving toward friendly lines. By noon, 29 had been accounted for. 13 still unlocated. The 40 thieves had been behind enemy lines for less than 2 days, and they had already suffered heavy losses. Yet their mission wasn't over. In fact, the hardest part still lay ahead, because as the search team scoured the jungle, a radio call came from one of the forward squads. 5 Marines were alive, but trapped, deep inside a cave system, surrounded by Japanese patrols, and reaching them would require a rescue that broke every rule of reconnaissance. By dawn, 23 Marines from the platoon had made it back inside American lines. 17 were still missing. Some might have slipped deeper into the jungle. Some might have been wounded. Some might no longer be alive. But none of those uncertainties changed what Tachiki decided to do next. Their mission had never included rescue work. A reconnaissance platoon wasn't expected to search for missing men, break into enemy territory, or carry exhausted Marines through Japanese patrol routes. Their role was information, nothing more. But Tachiki didn't wait for instructions. By mid-morning, reports began arriving from search teams. 2 Marines found dehydrated but alive. 3 others who had reached the lines overnight. And then the message that forced action. 5 Marines were alive inside a cave system nearly a mile behind Japanese-controlled ground. They weren't wounded, but they were trapped. Patrols crossed the front of the cave every few minutes. 1 Marine had malaria, another could barely walk. They would not survive until evening. Tachiki organized a 6-man team and stepped back into the jungle. The route to the cave ran straight through contested terrain. No artillery could support them. No diversion was possible. The only option was to move quietly and accept whatever waited along the way. They reached the cave at 12:33 p.m. The trapped Marines were exhausted but intact. Canteens were passed around. Gear was redistributed to lighten the load. No one said much. Everyone understood the time pressure. 400 yards into the return, the rescue team ran into a Japanese patrol. 20 soldiers, too close to avoid, too many to outrun. The ambush lasted 7 seconds. The patrol was wiped out. The jungle, however, carried the sound farther than they wanted. Voices and whistles rose behind them. The group moved into a ravine for temporary cover, but the terrain worked against them. Steep walls funneled them forward until the ground stopped abruptly. A box canyon, a dead end. Japanese forces were already appearing along the rim. While the Marines formed a hasty perimeter, 2 men searched the canyon wall. Behind a curtain of plants, they found a narrow crack, barely wide enough to force a body through, but it led upward. One at a time, packs and weapons were pushed through. The passage turned into a cramped stone corridor, climbing toward daylight. At 2:07 p.m., the Marines emerged on the far side of the ridge, still behind Japanese lines, but unseen. 8 minutes later, they crossed back into Marine territory. When the count was complete, 34 of the original 40 thieves were alive. No reconnaissance platoon in the Pacific had ever attempted or survived a mission like this. They had stepped far beyond report only. They had gone after their own. When the battle for Saipan finally ended, the 40 thieves walked out of the interior beaten down, thinner than they had ever been, and carrying losses that would stay with them long after the war. They were not a formal special operations unit. They were never advertised as pioneers. Most of them returned home quietly, unwilling or unable to describe what they had done in those jungles. But the impact of their work didn't disappear. It filtered upward, into how the Marine Corps thought about reconnaissance, and into how the U.S. military began shaping small, highly capable teams in the decades that followed. Before Saipan, reconnaissance in the Pacific was often treated as a supporting task. A rifle company might send a few scouts forward, gather quick terrain notes, and return. The 40 Thieves changed that expectation. They showed that a small, trained unit could move deep behind enemy lines for days, navigate alone, operate without supervision, and make independent decisions that influenced the outcome of a battle normally shaped by entire regiments. None of the techniques they used had official names in 1944. Later, they did. Doglegging, irregular movement to avoid predictable trails. Silent travel across dead ground, terrain invisible to the enemy. Multi-day infiltration without resupply, operating with minimal radio contact. Extracting fellow Marines when no support existed. These practices were far from standard, but they demonstrated a style of reconnaissance that emphasized initiative over rigid structure, adaptability over procedure, and independence over constant oversight. After the war, the Marine Corps studied what had worked on islands like Saipan, Peleliu, and Okinawa. In 1957, the Marines formally created Force Recon, a unit designed to move far ahead of conventional forces, develop intelligence deep inside enemy territory, and operate with the same self-reliance the 40 Thieves displayed under fire, this time supported by doctrine, training, and structure. Around the same period, the U.S. Navy was refining its own approach to unconventional warfare. The Navy's special operations lineage ran through the World War II Scouts and Raiders, Naval Combat Demolition Units, and the Underwater Demolition Teams, precursors to what, in 1962, became the SEAL Teams. Their mission demanded traits that echoed what the 40 Thieves had proven mattered: silence, initiative, endurance, and the ability to act far from support with no guarantee of rescue. The 40 Thieves were not the direct ancestors of any modern unit, but the way they operated, alone, forward, and silent, reflected a kind of warfare that would later define America's elite forces. They showed that elite capability isn't always built from perfect soldiers. Sometimes it's built from men who simply refuse to quit, even when the mission says, report only.